Today you'll hear about new methods and techniques for managing Agile project portfolios. You'll learn how these methods help companies systematically improve expected returns by actively responding to market and business changes. There's time at the end of this presentation to answer your questions, so please submit your questions online using the GoToWebinar question box on your screen. In a few days, you'll receive an email with links to this recording and copies of the slides. It's lunchtime for a lot of you, so let's grab a bite at the cafe next door where we're listening in on a conversation between Brian Stallings and John Rudd.
Hey, good to see you again, Brian. It's been a while since we worked together at Oldco. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for agreeing to meet with us for lunch.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's been about, 3 years since we were working together. You know, when I asked if you could meet for lunch today, it took a little while to get a table. Sorry about that.
No problem.
But I wanted to get some answers from you that will help me get acclimated to the new company. You know, I've been a little bit uncertain since joining.
Oh, uncertain. I don't like to hear that. I mean, I was hoping this was going to be a great fit, you and this company.
Sure.
What's on your mind?
Absolutely. And thanks for the referral that helped me get this job. But, you know, over at Oldco, where we used to work together, we've been doing Agile projects there for quite a few years. Well, and I thought we had a good level of maturity, and so feeling like I knew how Agile projects go, like real options.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, web events made easy.
Something called IRR Plus. You know, I looked that last one up online, and all I got were a bunch of ads for financial companies.
Yeah, well, the good news here is at the project level, it's pretty much the same at NewCo as it was at Oldco when we worked together. Where the differences are is with the portfolio. And all those terms that you've talked about, and I've got a couple of others, are new, but it's different in that in our old system, we used to have the old portfolio waterfall system try to interact with Agile projects. The fact that we now have altered our system so that it's more Agile, just in terms of our methods at the project level, at the portfolio level. So, you know, I'd be happy to walk you through it during lunch here today.
You know, that was my hope in inviting you to lunch. I know we don't have a lot of time, but maybe we could go through the way things work at a high level. That would help me out a lot.
I'd be glad to do it. So let's think. I mean, it's a lot of stuff to go through. I'm going to try to keep it pretty high level. Maybe I'll start with capital allocation. Do you remember how we used to do capital strategy at Oldco?
Sure. Sure, we had that annual budgeting process, right, driven by our business strategy. And we generally had a 5 or more year outlook. And capital budgets were reflecting on our business strategy priorities. So I remember we allocated by budget category during that annual budgeting process.
Yeah, and what was IT's role in that?
Well, I mean, we've always been a cost center, right, that responded to the business capital spending priorities. And IT's role has been to describe our capacity and our capability, and then maintain the competencies we needed to respond to business needs.
Yeah, that's right. The key difference you'll find here is that the IT and the business really work more as strategic partners. So when we talk about kind of business strategy and innovation, what we realized is the legacy businesses that we had, we no longer could rely on the performance of those over a long period of time. So we needed to bake innovation into our overall process because we needed to find out what tomorrow's benefits were going to be and figure out a way that our capital process could support that. So what happened is, yeah, in Oldco we used to do business strategy every 3 to 5 years. Our business strategy can change within the year now because, when we have a project that, or a product that was really kind of humming and all of a sudden the market shifts and changes, that requires us to shift and change. So what we've done is we've made modifications so that the budgeting is not so slow that we have locked ourselves into a plan for 12 months and then we don't have any way to kind of amend it or address it. What this does with our role from an IT perspective is that we now consult with the business from the beginning and the onset from the idea stage all the way through to project delivery and thereafter in terms of enhancements. So we're really very much acting as a strategic partner in this process.
Okay, so being a strategic partner is good. But John, I heard you say rapidly and annual budget planning in the same sentence. How do things move that quickly? At Oldco, I remember we start our budget planning cycles in September each year, and by November, the whole year would be locked down.
Yeah, so the big difference here is at Oldco we used to fund to the projects. And I think if you're 100% right, we need to get our project categories or candidates in the September-October timeframe. Maybe we could get one in November, and then that was locked down for the full year, so there was not a lot of budget flexibility. What we've done here is we have a different approach to the capital budgeting process. We have allocated into sectors, and there are 4 sectors. One is innovation. We also have product enhancement. A third sector is for efficiency, and then a fourth sector is for compliance and maintenance. And what this does now is the business makes a determination annually how much capital it wants to apply to each one of those sectors. So what we can do is we'll see that we have maybe more money in the emerging market sector if we're trying to build in more cash flow for future projects. We might have more conservative investments in our legacy business. And then what IT does is that we're informed on the emerging strategies, and then we advise the business on what we do. From a project funding basis, the projects are actually funded on a quarterly basis, so that we have flexibility to have new projects enter the mix in the year.
Okay. So how do you put together a project business case if you only get quarterly funding? I know that, historically, what I'm used to is the business case has been required to fund capital projects, and that business case fixes the outcomes that are expected, like the risk and reward expectations. And so what I've seen is that ideas get screened out if they've been too risky for the corporate risk profile. It helps you to avoid uncertainty, ensure that we're investing in safe places, and that we can plan for long returns. So these competing alternative strategies are all reduced down to what would be the best option for the company.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that doesn't work anymore because the best option for the company, we don't know. We don't have the certainty of kind of these long return projects. And in the method that you just talked about at Oldco, it would squelch the opportunity for innovation because they're always deemed as too uncertain on the front end, and there was no ability to kind of address that. So it was only the projects that were deemed to be safe that we could make the investments in. So what we've done here is we've introduced the concept of real options analysis. Real options analysis is really kind of navigates us through that thing called uncertainty. And remember we talked about if we don't know, what do we do? We've got the ability with real options to take a look at something that doesn't have that long return horizon and evaluate it a little bit further. We do this by taking seed money to investigate ideas, and these are ideas that in the past at Oldco we never would have considered because they were considered maybe too risky or something that we didn't have enough information to support or back. So we take this analysis from real options and in a stepwise manner, what we do is we investigate with a little investment. We determine whether an assumption makes sense or not. If it does, we make a further investment. We continue to do this. We can build knowledge and reduce the amount of uncertainty that's associated with that project. So the possibilities are explored on an incremental, so we variable by variable get ourselves to a more comfortable level. And what we can do then is maybe take 20 ideas where before they never would have had any consideration, but make enough of an investment so 2 or 3 of those might make it into the business case.
So the concept makes sense to me, but how does this work?
Well, the mechanics of it are that each sector has a determination of how much discovery it wants to do in its investments. Obviously, in the emerging market sector, we have a lot of discovery. And when we're doing things like internal projects, there's not going to be as much discovery because we have a sense of what we're trying to accomplish there. And then when we actually determine which of those from a discovery perspective we want to look at, we do T-shirt size. Remember T-shirt size?
Yeah, we use T-shirt size.
Okay, well the way that we apply it in real options is before we've done any work, really made any investment, we do something simple and we say, what do we think the size of the opportunity is here? What's going to be the revenue potential or the savings potential? And if it's an XXXL potential, and we kind of have a thumb in the air idea on the cost, and let's say it's a small cost, that's an easy one. That's going to slide to the top of the list. If we have something that has a medium opportunity but an XL cost, obviously those are the ones that are going to drop down to the lower part. So what we do then with the prioritized list is we focus on little investments in things like market analysis, exploring technologies, cost forecasting, And this is all around trying to find out more information so that we can start to build, get confidence, and gain enough information to move along in business case. Now we do this as long as the level of uncertainty is acceptable. If the level of uncertainty is not acceptable, it still may not pass muster.
Hey, how's your sandwich? It seems like I haven't let you have a bite.
All right, well, I'll get around to it. I have a tendency to be a quick eater.
Well, so what I wanted to ask you next was how do you factor uncertainty into the mix? I mean, come on, it's not like there's an uncertainty measurement out there.
That's true. We kind of figured, I think, a way to address that. What we used to do is we would just have our expected return for the project, and then we'd put kind of a green, yellow, red as it related to the various uncertainty. But what that did is it was hard to compare maybe an uncertain project with a high return against a low return project that had more certainty. We tried different methodologies and doing quadrants. And what we finally did was develop a method so that we could actually combine the return itself with the uncertainty so we could have an apples-to-apples comparison.
I know we were burned a couple of times at Old Co. That guy, Newman?
Oh, Newman, yeah.
Used to work in sales. Remember he came in with that $1 million deal and promised everybody that customer was ready to buy all that software. And then, well, remember what we
Oh, I remember very well. I had two teams that had to stop what they were doing. We put all of those folks and our resources on Newman's project. And the problem was that even after we did all that work, that case had never really been proven out. There was more uncertainty than we anticipated. And the thing ended up being a big bust, and it cost us the two projects that we were working on, so it was a real problem. So the way we addressed it, remember that funny thing you called that we talked about called IRR plus?
Right.
Okay, well that's where this comes into play. What we do is, from a business case value perspective, we look at internal rate of return. The reason we use internal rate of return is it's a way for us to compare one project against another. There are other methods for doing project valuation, but it's extremely important for us to find the ability to rank projects. So the other thing we do then is, after we got the internal rate of return for a business case, is we go and we give it an uncertainty score. We call it the beta score, and this is how we track uncertainty.
Beta, like in my investments class back in college?
That's we borrowed the term exactly from the old stock beta score. And remember, when you had a lot of volatility in the stock or uncertainty in the stock, and it had a high beta score. So we're borrowing the term here as well. That's how we judge our business cases. So the IRR then is adjusted based on the beta score, and that gives us an IRR plus. The reason we call it IRR plus is it means that we can now compare one business case against the other, so that we don't have to, have this uncertain thing called risk or uncertainty, which is, which is difficult for us to get our mind around how we're going to judge that. So what we do is the business case, as you know, is comprised around variables. We have project costs, we have revenues, we have expenses. So what we try to do is focus on the confidence value of each of these variables. Now you might have a couple of dozen variables in any business case. We only focus on, say, the 2 to 5 variables that are going to have a big impact in the project. From that 2 to 5, we do a confidence interval. How confident are we? What was the source data? Where did it come from? That those variables are going to be accurate. So from that, we come up with the beta score. The higher the beta score for these variables, that means the higher project uncertainty. So the IRR is the expected return when we actually take the return and combine with that certainty, the IRR plus. Now we have ways that we can modify the beta score if we have a high beta score. One is we do a high revenue beta. Okay, so that means that simple. If we have uncertainty around revenue, is we lower the revenue expectations and we get ourselves to a better level of certainty. If we have a high cost beta, reduce the scope. That means that we actually get it to a more manageable level, and when things are smaller, it's better for us to estimate. And if we have uncertainty around, say, emerging markets, what we really find is reducing time to market so we can establish very quickly that market feedback that establishes a way to address that beta.
So, John, how would this have helped in the case of that sales guy?
Well, in the case of Newman, what we would have done, because his revenue variable was never proven, it was a sales guy making a comment in a meeting. So this process, when we went through the business case, would have forced us all to take a look at the revenue line and find out what the source data was. And remember, it was only 2 months into it when people realized that there was no contract supporting that revenue. It was simply a conversation he had with his customer over lunch.
Okay, that makes sense. How's your sandwich, by the way?
Well, I'm getting through it. Thanks.
So let me see if I can summarize while you take a bite. Now, the old way this used to work from a business case perspective is we'd get a go, no-go decision that meant either all or none of the capital would be allocated for a particular project. And so capital was committed in large chunks and tied up for long durations. And I guess the challenge there was, as you described, new ideas couldn't be funded because that capital had already been allocated. But what you guys are doing here at NewCo, I guess we are doing, now that I'm an employee as well, is that we have smaller capital requirements that we can weight more favorably, and new projects can compete for that capital with projects that are already in progress. And this is reviewed at a quarterly, not multi-year or annual basis. So the outcome, it sounds like you'll get more projects funded because of those smaller capital allotments, and that capital is therefore spread across more possibilities. And sometimes you're even investing capital on tentative, that's like things you're trying to investigate to decide if you're going to proceed.
Yeah, you seem to have got it handled pretty well, and thanks for giving me a chance to finish my sandwich.
Well, I guess lunch is over already. I had so many other things to discuss.
You know what? I've got a great idea. We still have time here, and the pie in this place is fantastic. What do you say we have a slice of pie? Maybe you just continue further?
Well, that'd be great. I was eyeing that blackberry pie over there. So let me ask you, I'm not so sure what you meant when you said keep the business case open.
Yeah, okay. Remember we talked about that we do the sector funding on an annual basis, but the project funding is done on a quarterly basis. What that means is that all the investments we have, both existing and new, are re-examined each quarter, and they're ranked on their IRR plus basis. So the newly approved business cases can compete for capital with those projects that are previously funded based on how they rank on a relative basis. So an approved business case that, say, has a ranking of, on a return basis, let's say it's a 37% return, and it's all of a sudden going against a project that maybe has been underperforming, it now has the ability to bump that, assuming that we can put the pieces together. Underperforming projects are always going to be subject to be replaced, in this system. And when we do our final decision, the final decision is always dependent upon making sure that we have maximum portfolio performance. And I'll talk to you about that in just a second.
Well, here comes the pie.
Yeah, please, thanks. This coffee is fantastic.
Okay, so, what about project selection?
Yeah, okay, so each sector has, remember we talked about the sectors on the funding, each has its own beta threshold, and each has its own IRR threshold. So depending upon the business strategies and how that's set on the front end, that kind of, determines on a sector basis what we want to do. So maybe just kind of walking through from a project performance basis, what that means is we need to take it in the context of the sector, and we do something of a nesting of the prioritized projects. Nesting, that's another one of these crazy terms. So let me explain that in just a minute. Well, let's walk through the rest. So what that means, though, is it's matching our people and our resources with the projects. We'll talk about that in just a second. But what we do is we focus on cost of delay versus early exit. What I mean by this is we have one of those new projects that come in. It comes in with a high IRR. Well, if teams are already, what is the cost of delay on that project, and how's that going to impact the IRR plus? Similarly, we could look at an underperforming project and say, what about if we exit early, but then again, what's the impact of the exit early for that project? That takes into consideration something called sunk cost, and what's really important here, Brian, is that unlike our old company, when we take sunk cost, we cannot factor that in to the remaining cost for existing projects. If we have 2 or 3 sprints left, that's the cost that we compare the total return against, because we don't want to back ourselves into a corner making a bad decision to scrap a lot of work we've done because we're looking at costs that are already out the So all of these things give us our project metric. Now the way that ties into portfolio performance is that each portfolio is divided into various sectors. So we have 4 portfolios. Each sector has its IRR plus score, and then each project that changes impacts the overall performance of the sector. So we select projects then, not necessarily based on what the individual projects are going to do, but how the combination of these factors are going to lead to the highest portfolio performance and what the IRR plus is for that overall sector.
Okay, I think this makes sense.
Okay, so back to that nesting comment that I talked about, or that term nesting. Again, what this is matching our projects with our people and resources. And as you know, we love to have persistent teams at NewCo, just like we did at OldCo. And the advantage here is that we can get the right match of people that are high performing and have them continue. Now, when we have a new project that comes in, we need to find a project that has a good technology match, with the persistent teams. And if all of our teams are spoken for, or let's say that they've got releases that are going to come well down the road, we need to look at things at team ramp time. And then how is that going to impact the IRR? Or do we even have people that are available? So that ties into the overall capacity planning and where we are and what our limitations are from a capacity perspective. We always have the ability to look at buy versus build and outsourcing. And again, a lot of times there was a pushback on outsourcing. The advantage to this is instead of waiting to do a project, even if outsourcing is a little bit of a higher cost, it may be cheaper to do it at the higher cost than take on that cost of delay. So from a portfolio optimization, each one of these changes is going to change the expected portfolio return. So in an iterative fashion, we continue to look for the optimal solution in terms of where we want to start and put the team together.
Okay, that makes sense. This pie is really good. You should try some.
All right, I'll dig into it.
So I think I get IRR plus now, but I'm still fuzzy about something. Well, 2 things actually. You said you explained nesting.
Yeah, nesting. Okay, so where nesting comes from is it comes from the cut and sew manufacturing industry. In the old days, they'd buy this big bolt of fabric and they would then start punching out patterns for shirts on it. And at the end of the day, they'd look and they'd have all this waste on the ground. So then what they thought about a little bit and said, well, maybe if we rearrange the patterns on the fabric so we weren't wasting so much fabric, you might put pants or other things that you were going to use for that fabric, and you start punching that out. But the goal was to continue to tighten and tighten and tighten those various patterns together until you got to the point where you're optimizing and minimizing waste.
Oh, so you're talking about this like from planning and scheduling perspective.
Exactly. So
orienting the pieces so they fit up.
Exactly. So if we look at a schedule where we have a number of persistent projects and we have releases, say that are out a couple of sprints or even a quarter or 2, we want to look and see where can we optimally match a project from a time perspective to meet those persistent teams, and recognizing that that means that we're going to push projects out, a quarter or 2, we have to analyze the impact and see if we need to rearrange and maybe exit something earlier than we might have done otherwise.
It's interesting. So the second thing I was wondering about is, when you're talking about portfolio optimization, how is expected return updated?
Okay, well, we have something that we call a dynamic project charter. So what that means is that the business case remains open and it's revisited on a regular basis. The first thing we do is, because we have 2-week sprints and a 2-week iteration basis, we take a look at a revised scope and revised schedule, and that comes up with a new cost. So we can actually modify what our expenses are and reflect kind of the current delivery pace into what's going on. Then on a monthly basis, we resync with the business, and we can find out with new sales and marketing forecasts, projected savings, those kinds of things. So what we're doing is, on one side, we're taking input that we've learned from the project. On the other side, we're taking input from the business, and we pull these things together to recast the IRR plus. And then on a quarterly basis, what we can do is we can now have a ranking, or an IRR plus ranking, which is up to date, as opposed to like we did in OldCo, to use the same return expectation from a business perspective that was started months ago may not be relevant. This has a tendency to be much more relevant and gives us better information.
Ooh, how was your pie?
Oh, it's fantastic. This place is awesome.
So when we talk about metrics or I mean, the old way that I'm acquainted with, that we experienced together, was, you know, we'd have sort of red light, green light for projects. We track project burn. But, you know, it seemed like we always got stung because projects would go from green to red overnight. I hope you found a better way to monitor the project portfolio.
Yeah, I think so. We've got kind of five key metrics that we look on. The release burn-up chart, which we've always used at the team level, is the business is found to be very, very, very important in all of their planning. So when you take a look at it from their perspective, what they have is they have a method, and again, with our persistent teams that are performing after a couple of sprints, and we can establish a reasonable velocity rate, they have a very good method for being able to project when a release is going to take place. And then based on that, we can apply the cost and get a very good indication as to what the cost is there. So that has a tendency to be, you know, extremely valuable. And then obviously as the backlog shifts, this will shift as well. So we can always keep an eye on it. The next metric we use is the IR plus. This gives us the, you know, the uncertainty ranking, and it allows us to look at a project-by-project basis and make sure that everything is being compared on an apples-to-apples basis. And then we have something called dollar risk. And what dollar risk is, it's the total write-off risk of a project, and it's the write-off risk from today until the next release. And our finance guys really latched onto this one because a few years ago they got burned on a couple of waterfall projects that didn't deliver. They were big, big numbers. So they're very focused always to say, hey, if all the expectations, even if you're really certain about this, if things don't work, what's the total amount that we're going to have tied up in this? So the other thing we look at is what's the cost of change and what's the value of change. We go back to the burn-up chart. So if the business comes in and they want to add stories or they want to add something to the release, that's going to have an impact. And we can, you know, again, with established velocity, with the increased points, have a pretty good idea what that means in terms of the delay, and also have a pretty good idea in terms of what that means in terms of cost. We then recalibrate the overall business case based on those components, and you can see what the value of that change is. On a quality basis, we focus on definition of done, and we have sprint quality metrics that confirm quality code every 2 iterations.
You know, John, discussing how NewCo uses project metrics has helped my understanding a lot. I'm not sure, how would you use them in the governance process?
Well, first of all, we have the return standards. So each sector has a return standard. So if a project doesn't meet that standard, it's not going to merit. So that's the first kind of threshold. Next, we go into the uncertainty threshold, and this is the beta score. And again, by sector, we have different beta scores, meaning our innovation sector has a pretty high beta score that's allowed, and our internal project sector has a relatively low beta score that's acceptable. So by sector, we make a determination as to whether this project, has too much uncertainty or enough uncertainty for us to be comfortable. So the next is people and resource allocation. We talked about how the PMO can use all of these tools in terms of what the available teams are, contract costs, cost of delay, cost of early exit, and what they're always doing is they're optimizing to make sure that it fits in. And again, the gate here is the sector IRR plus, make sure that they're optimizing for that. On a quality basis, the organization sets the quality standards. We confirm that every sprint, again, through the definition of done, that we're hitting those standards. And we also can apply metrics to confirm that we're doing the appropriate testing and what have you. So finally, and this is the key here, is that each quarter we realign the portfolio. So what we can do is we're taking the capital that we have and we're applying it quarterly to those projects that are going to give us, from a business perspective, the most opportunity for success. And this is the key, Brian, because everything else from a governance perspective and a metrics perspective doesn't matter. What matters is that on a continuous basis, we can ensure that we're putting the capital where it belongs.
Wow, that's all so fascinating. I'm having a bit of trouble putting it all together, though.
Maybe I can help. What he said was,
strategy is set through sector bucket allocation. Capital budgets are set annually by sector, not by project. Using row options will help you to determine your winning business cases. IRR is adjusted to reflect uncertainty, so projects can be more evenly ranked. IRR Plus determines your quarterly project priority. Project selection is based on portfolio and not project optimization. Expected return is continually updated based on available data. Project performance informs the quarterly active portfolio review. So, active portfolio management is the center of continuous collaboration between IT and the business. Oh, and here's the check.
While John and Brian are paying their check, let me tell you a bit about Solutions IQ. We have more than 30 years of experience delivering software using our range of consulting services, from training and coaching to talent acquisition services, all the way to total outsourced development. We focus on giving our customers the tools and collaboration they need to succeed with any Agile project or transformation. Now, let's take a few questions.
Okay, John, I've got a question that came in from the wire. So, do you use some predefined weights to adjust IRR to an IRR plus because of uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, what we find is that there's an evolution in this process, and it actually requires a lot of discipline. And what was kind of astounding with some of the clients that we've worked with is that there's so little that goes into the business case, or what does go into the historical business case was more formulaic because it was viewed as a kind of hurdle that you needed to get over. And once it was done, it could be put to bed. But the fact that this becomes dynamic and part of the process and that business case is really left open throughout the entire development of the project, what we wanted to do is focus on, not doing overkill, but really just kind of choosing those variables that made the most sense and focusing on that. Now, when I say it was, kind of step by step, first of all, an organization does this to take this step and build out a disciplined business case with the variables. Number two would be to identify the key variables that are going to make an impact. And then number three, you can be fairly sophisticated in how you do a ranking of that, or you can be thumb in the air that just says, you know what, we don't have enough support. Maybe let's do some further investigation on a real options basis so that we can build out the proof of this a little bit more.
Great. This next question goes a little deeper on that. So how do you secure that business cases will not be abused just to simply get a project started without a lot of follow-up? Seems to talk about active portfolio management.
Yeah. So that again, we get into business cases have a tendency in the old way to be a little bit more political.
Some folks might know Newman in their own organization.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So we've all seen that where it becomes political jockeying as opposed to what makes the most sense. What I like to recommend is that the finance department becomes the arbiter in these things. So if the business has something that's really kind of pushing for, that's great and that's fantastic. But if you get somebody who is really evaluating the numbers of the business case and the variables, and that's when you get in, it's their job to give you their confidence interval on each of the variables, it starts to draw this out. And, the politics goes away and it starts to get into the rigor of the numbers.
Great. So when you assess high-risk projects, is IRR plus a quantified measurement or more of a gut feel? Another question.
Okay, and again, depending upon how you're approaching your data, it's certainly quantified. It needs to be quantified, and that's how we need to rank. And I want to pause on this for a second. There is net present value that companies will use. You've got, payback method. There are other ways that people have return on investment. The problem with a number of those is you can't compare project to project. The beauty of IRR as the baseline is it compares project to project. And again, the concept of addressing the uncertainty element through taking the beta scoring and coordinating this is an evolution beyond that. So on a first basis, it may be gut feel, that people may push it into quadrants and say this is the top quadrant risk, lower and lower, and then it can actually become more and more over time tied into a formula. So when we take a look at confidence factor, at some point we're going to apply a number, and then on a risk-adjusted basis or on an uncertainty-adjusted basis, we're actually going to drive down the expected return for those riskier projects. And what we try not to do is get precisely inaccurate and attack all of the variables and do it with all the projects. To the extent that we have baseline projects, we leave those alone. We'll call that baseline certainty or baseline data. It's only those projects that are more speculative.
That's good. You actually just answered two questions. One on who does IRS plus calculations. You said finance, that's your recommendation. And then whether something like ROI could be used instead, and you suggested IRR. So here's a question. The cost of internal resources, or people I guess they mean, is different from outsourcing. So do you somehow factor into the business case this outsourcing?
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to the perfect world is that, let me say two things. So when you're doing your capacity planning on an annual basis, you have an expectation as to what needs you need to meet. And depending upon the organization, what I would like to recommend is that your FTEs, your full-time employees, will always hit your threshold low. That's going to reduce waste. So in a pinch, you've got FTEs that can cover what would be the low ebb. In terms of the high portion of the ebb, I like to fill that on a contract basis. And again, this is theoretical, so that you've got the ability to build capacity over time. Unfortunately, a lot of our teams are a combination of contractors and FTEs. That's reality that we're dealing with. So in that environment, when we're looking at projects on a quarterly basis, a new project comes in and it's got a very high score. And if it has a high score, but all of our teams are dedicated and they're working on other projects that we view to have high scores, now the business has the opportunity to say, okay, we're going to step out, we're going to outsource. It'll reduce the return score of the project that they're looking at because there's a higher cost, but that's better than passing on the project. If it reduces the score to a point where it doesn't hit your threshold anymore, that answers your question, but to the extent it hits your threshold, obviously you move forward with it.
Great. So this question asks more along the lines of about these bets that you might want to make in investigating new potential opportunities. The question is how much in percent terms are used in investigations and how many ideas make it stop?
Yeah, so a number of our clients, have different needs and opportunities. If you're on the cutting edge of technology and what you're doing, that innovation sector is going to be much, much bigger. So the other way you can kind of look at that is what's the product life cycle that you have for your existing product. So if you take a look out and you say, boy, we've got a very stable, installed base, and nothing's going to change for the next 10 years, that innovation can maybe drop down and you take a look at kind of this cash return over time. The reality is for most businesses, though, there's not that confidence, there's not that certainty in what's going to happen tomorrow, so there's the need for continued innovation. In terms of the percentage of that, it depends on where you are with your products on their life cycle. If you're tail end of the life cycle, you better be making a big innovation bet. And to the extent that you're more stable and you can see that cash flow for 12 to 18 months, that might be a smaller bet, but it's still something you're going to have to focus on.
Great. Here's a question. It says, it sounded like you said you could ignore some costs, right? But somebody's got to take responsibility for all that.
Yeah, you never ignore sunk costs, but this is a very important distinction. When you are using active portfolio management and you're making decisions around the projects, in particular when you're talking about does it make sense for us to do an early exit on a project? And let me give you an example. Let's say you've got something that you've got $2 million into, and it was going to have a great return, but the market changed and the return's a lot more modest now. So when you just take a look at what that project's IRR plus, it's sunk, it's low. Let's say that you've got $2 million into it and there's another $500,000 to get to the release. So you look at the $500,000, if you take the IRR plus score of the full 2.5, it's going to be a no. It doesn't make sense. It sinks to the bottom of the list. But you only have $500,000 more, so it's your future investments that you're focused on. So you need to take that $500,000 and apply it against the total return of the project. That's going to bump the IRR plus score, and it's going to drive you to the right decision. It means that that $500,000 of capital that you deploy is going to get you the best return. Even though the project on a sunk basis hurts, that $500,000, that's where you want to spend it. Now, where you don't want to ignore sunk costs is it's extremely important from a kind of corporate hygiene perspective that the business cases, they continue to stay open, and once that project is launched and once you've got the release, you're always examining the details and the results from that, and you are confirming that you're actually hitting the spot. Or to the extent that you were not successful in your projections, then you use that feedback loop to help you in your future business cases.
Thank you. So, John, there's quite a few questions about tools, from one type of a tool to another. So maybe we can be a little generic about this question. What tools would we recommend, if any, that support this approach?
Well, you know, on a business case basis, a lot of the big tool that people use is Excel. And I'd say that's, you know, that in combination, obviously, with tracking and on a metrics basis, you've got version 1, which is a, you know, kind of a fine tool manufacturer. But on a business case basis, you know, to build that out, you know, I think the flexibility that an Excel spreadsheet gives you is pretty good. There are certainly limitations around that.
So if your organization is doing something currently for project, for creating that, you could continue with those same tools, and maybe that you're going to create different bits of information in that.
Yeah, yeah, it's what you're driving. It's what you're driving together. But a lot of things, so you take a look at the burn-up chart, and you know some of these things. That's you can get that through your version 1, you know, interface from a tool.
Okay, and some of the tools that we're already using to track where quality is at, and et cetera. So it doesn't have to be a lot of changes necessarily. So here's another question: are PMOs open to Agile portfolio management?
When you open, I'm not sure what the intent of that is, but let's just put it this way. I think that there's, you know, we've been doing Agile for 10 years now, I think. And when we started doing consulting 8 years for this, for the most part, we saw it at the team level. And I would say the bulk of what we were doing is helping teams kind of get along despite the organization. And what we're really seeing now is it's more of a top-down. So what we find is that the PMO is not necessarily, you know, pushing against Agile. What they're more interested in is they're curious as to how do we do this. And remember, all of what we've done from a business perspective were baked into the old business case. And we spent 50 years developing, you know, how we approach business cases. Agile's very different, so it's going to take a while for us organizationally to make the appropriate changes as well.
Now, that's been my experience too. Sometimes you get your friendly PMO who wants to be a part of making change happen. Other times, it's some sort of a job to convince them, and maybe they have their doubts.
Yeah, and in some respects, that is the job to convince. It's you know, in I think any time an organization goes through change, it's uncomfortable. But there's cultural change that goes along with this because this is very different.
Sounds like a whole other living. So here's a question. Sounds like this is mostly about new products or initiatives. In our organization, we mostly do enhancements to existing apps. Does this apply to us, or is it just for new products?
I mean, certainly the presentation was focused on innovation because that's what drives it. But when you take a look at real options, don't think about from innovation. Just think about it driving variables to more certainty. So making those incremental investments, certainly doing the business case and doing it on a risk-adjusted basis. And it may be that, you know, as a result, your beta scores are not going to be that high, so that there's not that much variation from an uncertainty perspective from one project to the next. But using the methodology of ranking on a quarterly basis, funding projects on a quarterly basis, and making sure that you're betting on the winners and always continually shuffling your capital to the winners makes tremendous sense. Still makes tremendous sense.
Good. Time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. What is the most important difference between a classical project portfolio management approach and this Agile portfolio management?
Okay, so what I would say is the classical approach is somewhere on top of a mountain, a business case is approved. And then it goes to the PMO, and the PMO is told execute, deliver this business case. And the big difference here is that instead of it being two sides, and one of the things that's always really bothered me is people talk about the business or they talk about IT, so they're not even in the same organization. And what's extremely important is to realize that this is an iterative process, and when you establish an iterative process, there's a link. It's a partnership. Those pieces tie together. So probably the biggest, from a cultural shift perspective, is making sure that that link is tied and the communication isn't just, here's the business case, execute, but it's flexible and that those feedback loops are established.
There are so many great questions, more than we can answer here. So please contact us at solutionsiq.com so we can continue this conversation. Thanks for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.